How's it going, everybody? And welcome to this amazing dynamic lecture on the science of fat loss and the practical how-tos. In this video, you're going to have a basic understanding of how fat loss actually works and the underlying mechanisms thereof, as well as walk away with some practical how-tos on how you can actually achieve this in the real world. And we're going to try to make it as simple as possible, but also give you an understanding not just of the how to do it and the what to do, but also the why do we even know that this is the case. Mostly because you'll find a lot of misinformation on the internet and through other people that are that just don't understand how this all works. Okay, so first and foremost, okay, the fact of the matter is, fat loss is definitely a case, it's a problem of calories in versus calories out. A lot of people don't like to hear that for whatever reason, but the fact of the matter is calories in versus calories out is king. Now, where people get that wrong is that the calories out part, okay, which has to do with burning energy, basically. That can be done through so many different means, some of which can be, changes in your hormones, so like your thyroid hormone, testosterone to cortisol ratio, as well as how much muscle mass you're carrying, because that affects your overall basal metabolic rate, which is the rate at which you burn caloric energy. Okay? The higher your basic metabolic rate, the more calories you can consume per day without gaining excess body fat. And another one would be the thermic effect of feeding, also known as TEF, which is basically how much energy your body burns metabolizing certain macronutrients. Okay? So these are all extremely important for understanding how to effectively burn body fat, and more importantly than that, how to stay consistent with a sustainable plan over the long term. Because it's one thing to just do some kind of really effective crash diet. You know, like I've had a client who dropped over 100 pounds in a matter of 3 months, and he put 100 pounds onto his deadlift somehow at the same time. He was not following my diet protocol. He was following a alternating every other day fasting protocol, which was crazy on top of the high intensity interval training and the progressive overload training we were doing with the barbell lifts. That is not something I recommend to the average population, but he definitely did not sustain that fat loss after a while. So yes, sustainability is extremely important. It's not so much how much weight you can lose in the short term. It's how much weight you can lose over the long term and make it an enjoyable and sustainable lifestyle that's not incredibly challenging to adhere to and to make a permanent change, basically, right? We want it to be fun and easy and eventually a natural habit of your everyday life, okay? So, first and foremost, we have to understand macronutrients and their role in fat loss. So if calories in versus calories out is the main driver of fat loss, which we verified because we have metabolic ward studies. So a lot of people who are against calories in versus calories out are they'll tell you, well, we need genetically equivalent twin studies in a metabolic ward where we control for everything else, and they have these really high standards for intervention trials and science that realistically cannot ever be met under any circumstances for any subject or intervention of health science. And then, of course, they go and they use mechanistic studies on rats and things to try to support their own point. And it's like not really a productive use of the information that we have. That's not how science works. Of course, it's important to always keep your mind open to nuance when you understand that no form of science or combination thereof is perfect. So we should not be thinking in absolutes. But for practical uses and applications, we have to have a set of guidelines that actually work in the real world and are supported by evidence. And so that's why we have metabolic ward studies that support this, where basically we find unequivocally, no matter what macronutrient breakdown, when the total energy in is that's coming in is less than the total amount of energy coming out, we have fat loss. And remember, muscle mass, protein intake, and all these other things will modify that, okay? All right. So, different types of foods. So, first of all, protein intake, okay? So, protein, there are some studies, the majority of studies, if you average them all together, typically will show protein consumption and metabolizing protein has around double the thermic effect of food, or the thermic effect of feeding. So, double the caloric burn compared to something like fat. And then carbohydrates is kind of like a gray area, as we're seeing now in the unfolding literature. But carbohydrates and fat are typically seen as kind of equal caloric burn, okay? So protein basically burns more calories is what we want to get out of it for practical purposes. The amount of calories burned through the metabolism of carbohydrates versus fat is not entirely understood right now, and it's really not even that significant of a difference. But with protein intake, without a shadow of a doubt, we've seen consistently when the body metabolizes protein, you do burn more calories. And this is why in the golden standard of evidence on protein intake, or on metabolic ward trials and intervention studies that are comparing diets and fat loss together, we have to control for protein intake. So protein must be equated in all intervention studies on fat loss diets being compared, okay? So protein intake, number one most important thing that we start with. It's the foundation, okay? So double the caloric burn of calories out from protein intake. That's the first thing. The second thing is protein supports lean mass development, and we know the more lean mass that we carry, the more calories our body burns at rest, also known as basal metabolic rate. So the higher our basic metabolic rate is, the more calories you burn at rest, the more fat your body's basically burning when you're not doing any kind of activity, or when you are doing activity. You're burning more fat overall throughout the day in every activity that you do with a higher metabolic rate. And so your body basically can take the calories that you eat and turn it and store it as body fat, or it can take the calories you eat to fuel lean muscle mass development, okay? And this is why people who are trying to put on muscle typically are going to need a calorie surplus so that they have extra calories that their body can use to build lean tissue. And so your body basically is eating those calories and turning into muscle. Your muscle eats calories is what we want to think. So either your body fat can be created from calories, or your muscle can be created from calories, okay? So more muscle, so more protein intake means already more caloric burn to metabolize it, more fat loss. More protein means more lean mass development over time, along with resistance training. And more lean muscle mass development means more calories burnt as well. So more protein intake overall, as far as calories out, is a net positive. It is a double whammy. And there's more benefits to higher protein intake that we're going to get to in a bit that further enhance the fat loss benefits. But before we get to that, there's two things I want to discuss. The first thing is the studies on the thermic effect of feeding and the caloric burn from protein intake. There are studies that seem to suggest, there's a couple studies actually that seem to suggest We don't actually even know the limit of caloric burn and protein intake. There's some crazy studies showing the more protein that you eat, even up to 3 grams per pound of lean mass per day, which is a lot of protein. So for someone who is 100 pounds, which is very light actually, eating 300 grams of protein, or has 100 pounds of lean mass, eating 300 grams of protein a day, supposedly can equal more lean mass if the training protocol is correct, as well as significantly more fat burn. But we don't go based on that because that just sounds a little bit too far-fetched and is not the average of what the evidence says. So, beyond that, there's also studies, some really good literature that also has shown. So there's an intervention trial where they take the people on the average, American diet, standard American diet, eating the regular kind of amount of protein, around 0.5 grams per pound of lean mass per day. Typically, so they took one group who continued eating that, half a gram of protein per pound of lean mass, and then they took another group who was eating that and they doubled their protein intake, where they're now eating 1 gram of protein per pound of lean mass per day, which is actually the recommended optimal intake as far as the scientific literature is concerned. And what they find is without even resistance training, just continuing to live their own normal lifestyle, usually sedentary, desk jobs and stuff like that, the group that ate double the protein without resistance training actually had a significant increase in lean mass from increasing their protein intake alone. So what that shows me, at least, is that the human body naturally wants more protein than most people are giving it. And in order to be healthy and support our bone structure and our musculoskeletal system, especially into old age, especially with the literature showing as humans get older, they become anabolically resistant and need more protein over time to be healthy in general. The optimal protein intake is probably around that 1 gram of protein per pound of lean mass range. If the normal human being who doesn't need resistance train adds a significant amount of muscle mass from just increasing their protein intake, to me that looks like their body needs more protein, basically. So as far as health concerns are regarded in relation to protein intake, that's a whole nother rabbit hole to go down. But basically, glutathione production, your immune system, and a variety of hormones and other molecules required for general health are reliant upon your protein intake. Neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin are reliant on your protein intake. So baseline health, and especially fat loss, protein is absolutely important. And to me, this seems to be the real reason why the vast majority of nutritional programs, whether they're on an extreme of like ketogenic diets or carnivore diets or paleo diets, or they're evidence-based flexible dieting if it fits your macros or whatever, as long as these all these diets are higher in protein, typically people find greater health, fat loss outcomes as well as health outcomes, probably because of these things we just talked about. So beyond that, now we have satiety. Okay, satiety. So there's a lot of different food. So satiety is basically how hungry or how satisfied you feel when you eat food, and the removal of hunger, of the sensation of hunger. Okay, different types of foods increase your satiety. Okay, different suppression of hunger. So first, since we're on the topic already, protein intake is one, especially lean protein, supposedly, is one of the most satiating foods. Again, another reason why you want a high protein intake. The more lean protein you consume in your diet, the less hungry you become overall, as well as all the fat loss benefits. So beyond that, whole foods in general are highly satiating, okay? And what we see in evidence-based nutrition circles and large meta-analysis, cohort studies, as well as randomized controlled trials, there was a intervention study that came out, I believe, in 2020 by Kevin Hall et al. that compared low-carb ketogenic diets that are whole food to plant-based whole food diets that were very low in fat and high in carbs. They showed no significant difference in fat loss outcomes. They all lost a substantial amount of fat, regardless of whether they're animal-based keto or like whole foods-based plant-based diets or whatever. But the common denominating factor is that they are eating whole foods. And to those who don't know, when you eat a whole food plant-based diet, you're getting a lot of protein just from your overall caloric intake. Okay, because when your main staple foods are beans, brown rice, whole grains, one serving of brown rice, and don't quote me on this because I don't eat grains and stuff, but still, something like 7 grams of protein per serving of whole grains, typically, especially things like rice, and it depends on the grain. The point that I'm trying to make, though, is whole foods, whether it's high carb diet, plant, they're higher in fiber, they're higher in protein. They are harder to digest, depending on what you mean by harder. But they take longer to digest. There's more steps along the process. For example, fibrous grains. Fiber alone. Fibrous plant foods substantially increase your satiety. They slow gut motility, which makes the food longer to digest. They basically slow the gastric emptying of the majority of the contents of your stomach. They're entirely digested by bacteria in the intestine, which is a pretty long-winded process if you ask me. And the glycemic load overall of any kind of whole plant food is relatively low. Depending on which ones we're talking about, they vary. And when you consume whole foods in a kind of like combined macronutrient meal, like high protein, high carb, high fiber, and fat all together, the glycemic load and the gastric emptying of this food combination is suppressed significantly as a combination. So for health outcomes, that's a whole another rabbit hole to go down. This does not apply because most people know it's highly nuanced as far as people autoimmune conditions and digestive issues. The slowing of gastric emptying from the fiber and stuff and the intestinal digestion, that is a whole nother thing to go down. But for fat loss and health markers like things like HDL cholesterol, lipoprotein, not technically cholesterol. People in the comments will always correct me on these semantics. But things like insulin, fasting insulin, and your blood glucose levels over time and things of that nature, hemoglobin A1C. These things will most likely regulate and go into the healthy range over time just by eating a healthy whole foods diet that is based around protein first and foremost, especially if you're getting 1 gram per pound of lean mass. You're probably not going to be very hungry for much else, especially if you eat some broccoli, cauliflower, spinach, maybe some beans and some like sweet potatoes on the side. You're going to feel so satisfied from those meals, and it's going to make you eventually modify your gut flora over time and your taste palate to where you only crave healthy foods. So anyway, as far as calories in versus calories out are concerned, especially if you're the type of person that just for whatever reason is completely resistant to tracking your food intake, this alone is going to provide you with a large amount of benefits. This is 20% of methods that will yield you the 80% of results. And it's so easy to kind of adhere to a program like this already, especially the more overweight you are, the most likely the easier it is for you to lose weight with a program like this. But so beyond this, so your ratio of carbohydrates to fat, okay, for fat loss in particular, the most important thing is that, so if you can, it would be ideal and optimal for you to track food using an app like Chronometer or MyFitnessPal, okay? I like Chronometer because it tracks micronutrient intake as well as your macros, and is connected to multiple large databases of different foods and the micronutrient content of all. But I also like MyFitnessPal because if you're working with a coach like myself, you can add them to your friends list, and I can keep track of your diary throughout the weeks and make sure you're staying on point and logging your food and not consuming in excess. So tracking your food is very important for a couple of reasons. So first of all, calories in versus calories out is the main driver of fat loss. However, like we mentioned already, there's a variety of things that can affect the amount of calories you're burning every day. So already, different people doing different diet programs, eating different amounts of protein, and doing different types of activity and exercise, holding different amounts of lean mass, having different hormonal compositions and different genetics, they're going to burn calories at different rates. So they're going to have different basic metabolic rates. It really, if we're trying to be accurate, is not as easy as calculating calories using whatever it is, the Harris-Benedict formula or whatever, if we're trying to be highly accurate. But for the sake of practical purposes, we need a starting place. And so calculating your basic metabolic rate and your caloric needs using a formula like Harris-Benedict or whatever is actually a good idea. And so we start with that. Try to estimate your basic metabolic needs. We can do that. And then we can track your food intake, and using a wearable tech calorie watch like this, okay, a heart rate monitor. Again, like, in the evidence-based community, there's a huge pushback against it, and I understand, again. But for practical purposes, this can track your steps and give you an average estimate of how intensely you're exercising every single day and how much volume of high-intensity exercise you're doing each day. It's important to understand none of these things are like perfect. Okay, this is not accurate in the slightest bit. The calorie counting watch, and neither is the food logging and stuff like that. Okay, the amount of calories you're eating and burning are probably extremely varied and not accurate at all. They're probably way off from what we're tracking, but that's not the point. On a practical level, we want to see how many steps you're walking every day, how much time your heart rate is remaining in an elevated mode, and we want to track your food intake, your general food intake over a period of weeks. Maybe 4 weeks is a good period of time, so that we know your average intake of food and all these things. And then from there, what we do is we troubleshoot. Okay, so we weigh the client at the beginning of the protocol and see how much weight they have right now, preferably using a body fat scan as well. So we know how much lean mass they have and fat mass, and we can see if they're losing muscle compared to fat, how much muscle they're losing compared to fat, etc. over time. And then at the end of the 4 weeks, we measure these things again. And I also measure waist circumference. Okay, so I'll use my tape measure and measure their waist, their stomach, or there's a lot of different areas. The waist depends on the clinician, but we measure people at the beginning and at the end, and we have a basic protocol we follow for 4 weeks. The more flexible it is at first, or the more basic it is, the better, because a lot of people have trouble kind of sticking to it, and it's a habit you got to build over time. And then we just see, like, what are your results? So if you have gained weight, especially gained fat mass, okay, then we need to modify something. We need to look at your food journal and, maybe remove a couple of things. If you typically eat a little bit too much bread, a little bit too often, maybe cut that down or remove that, or however many carbohydrates you're eating, or fats, especially fats. Fats are a really big one, because a lot of people, when they first start their fitness journey, they don't realize how much fat they're actually eating. They don't realize that there's like freaking soybean oil in basically everything, even meats that are pre-marinated. You'll find like chicken pre-marinated at the store that has soybean oil added. And so, maybe making a lot of your proteins leaner, looking for any kind of like hidden fats you might be consuming. and then removing a lot of the unnecessary carbohydrates. So carbs are not necessarily bad per se, but in the context of fat loss, we want to prioritize protein and then use fat and carbohydrates as kind of like our levers. Reducing fat first is a good way to go with the average population, depending on their goals. And then reducing carbohydrates is going to be kind of like a balancing act, okay? And it depends on what type of diet you're following. But this is for the average population who is just starting their fitness journey, okay? So for everyone who's going to grill me in the comments, like, oh no, like carbs are the devil and this and that, like, relax, okay? Because I understand the nuances of that as well. So anyway, so yeah, we basically look at where are you when you start, check your waist circumference, your current weight on the scale, and your body fat percentage to lean mass. And then we follow a basic program, clean up the diet based on whole foods, prioritize protein, follow a resistance training protocol that emphasizes progressive overload. We need to be adding a little bit of weight, a little bit of reps, a little bit of sets over time, preferably a little bit of reps and a little bit of weight. Double progression is what we call it when you first start. And some form of high-intensity interval training done maybe 2 to 3 times a week. Especially if you're working with a coach, you do resistance training and high-intensity interval training kind of concurrent periodization with a coach, 2 to 3 times a week, combined with a greater increase in overall activity. So the next part of this is how do you get your cardio in? So just increasing your steps has been shown in the literature to be a kind of like natural way of building positive habits that you don't even realize you're burning calories. So obviously simple things like taking the stairs instead of the elevator whenever possible, parking at the very end of the parking lot when you go to the grocery store. Any way you can increase the amount of overall activity you do during the day is going to be good. More chores, more walking the dog, more playing with your kids, going to the park with your kids and actually playing with them. All of these things are great way to increase your calories out without even noticing it, okay? And I've actually noticed a very huge correlation with some of my clients who they're like baristas or bartenders or waitresses or waiters, and they're walking around all the time and they have no trouble keeping fat off and losing body fat. They respond very easily and effectively to fat loss programs. But I've had some of them who then switch to desk jobs and suddenly they're eating the same thing, doing the same actual workout, but now they start to pack on body fat somehow. And so I found a huge correlation between the amount of activity someone does as a natural consequence of their job and their overall fat loss. Okay, so increasing, and that's what we call the non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So that's called NEAT, your NEAT, right? So yeah, increasing your NEAT. And on top of that, aerobic activity like just 60 minutes of low steady state cardiovascular activity is great, but we want to prioritize the weight training, circuit training, high intensity interval training and stuff like that. But we have to make sure we have to cater that to the individual. For some people, just doing 3 sets of 10 burpees with 1 minute rest in between is a high intensity interval training workout, and they're whooped, right? Which they should be able to get into shape really fast if you're working with a good coach. For other people, you need to do, burpee squat jumps into dumbbell thrusters with 30 seconds rest and doing 10 sets of 10 of some crazy like that, followed by heavy bag intervals and sprint shuttle runs and stuff like that, 400-meter relays or something. And then that's like a interval training for them. So, we have to build their work capacity over time and build their ability to recover, because it's kind of like a myth in the fitness industry where people, they think that there's like a certain arbitrary number of training sessions and reps and stuff people can recover from. But the fact is you can train your ability to recover and adapt to exercise over time. So anyway, that is it pretty much. Over time, you kind of look at the food that you're eating on your food log and the amount of exercise you're burning, the energy you're burning through your Fitbit. And we're looking at trends over time, okay? We're making connections and correlations. We're seeing, okay, you have done 20,000 steps a day or something for the last 4 weeks. And you're eating 2,000 calories a day, and you have been consistently losing, 4 to 5 pounds every month or something. That's been pretty good, that's been consistent. And then a month comes where you actually gain 5 pounds. And you see that this person has spent a lot less time in a high heart rate zone on their Fitbit or something. And maybe they're eating an average of 200 more calories. Or maybe they're eating, an average of 50 grams less protein per day than they were before when they're getting good results. And so then you just troubleshoot and you say, hey, eat a little bit more protein. This was working for you before, and since it looks like you changed that and it kind of lines up with the results that we're getting now, just, tweak that a little bit and, try to work on that moving forward so we can get back on the results train and keep making progress, right? So that is the process of fat loss in a practical sense. Also, obviously, all the science, I guess, I discussed. Hopefully that wasn't too complicated. The next step, though, above this, though, and this is where people get really weird with, is you need to be doing a diet that you can make a lifestyle that can keep you making progress over the long term, and it's not like a burden to you, right? And so there's a lot of ways you can go about this. For some people, they just need a little psychological boost and motivational coaching, and they can follow any kind of strict protocol. You'd be surprised at the crazy protocols I've seen some people follow just because they have the right mentality. So some people, they have extremist mentalities, which is fine, but it helps them adhere to extreme protocols. Some people, it's like it must be extreme or it's nothing, right? So these are the people you'll see that willingly follow like ketogenic or carnivore diets, okay? I'm not going to name any names, okay? Don't look at me. And they get amazing results, and they're able to stick to it, and they don't even see it as a burden at all. They go to social gatherings, and they choose to eat the burger patty and cheese only. You know what I mean? And maybe some lettuce and tomato if they don't have some weird dogma about that. And that works fine. But for a lot of people, if they have a trainer or someone who's like, hey, you need to eat this meat and fruit only diet, and you'll freaking lose all this weight, and it'll be amazing, and it's easy, and you don't have to track calories. That person might be like, all right, that sounds awesome, super motivated for a couple weeks. Then you don't hear from them for a while, and you're like, well, what happened? And it's like, I just fell off. I started eating the pasta my dad made, and I couldn't say no to my dad's pasta, my childhood memories. It's so delicious. I'm Italian, and it's like, you have to understand the psychology of each individual is going to require your methods as a coach to adapt for sustainable progress. So a lot of people, it can be a matter of, hey, I want you to just write down the overall diet, everything that you've eaten for the day. It doesn't have to be super specific. Some people, they cannot, for the life of them, track their food intake in an app like Chronometer. It's just too much numbers and filling things out, too many steps. For them, though, you might just say, hey, take a picture of every food that you eat, like a food vlog, and just send it to me. Okay, and they actually have apps like that now where you can track your food intake based on taking pictures. For some people, that works. Some form of tracking is important. Some clients will not put any effort at all. But the easier you make it for them, the more natural and easier it becomes for them over time. So that's an extreme of as a coach or a practitioner, things you got to do to kind of keep people on track. But the point is, though, the diet is going to need to adapt to the individual. So you need a healthy balance between what can we do to modify the calories out, inverse calories out equation and the protein intake as well to match this person's goals, whether it's fat loss or muscle gain or strength gain or whatever, in a way that is sustainable over the long term. We have to balance how effective is it? Is it going to get them progress? But also, is it something that they can adhere to? That is the main benefit of having a coach or personal trainer. But I don't know how many personal trainers actually do this to get their clients on track. But this is how people who actually are effective, like trainers who are effective, get their clients to do such a thing. So for some people, Mediterranean diet might be good. For some people, just reducing their portion sizes works well, right? So yeah, there's a science behind it that we already mentioned, and there's a practical aspect to it, and then there is adapting the protocol to your needs. Some clients with training, they're going to need, they're going to really only want to do kettlebell circuit training and burpees. Some others, they're going to want to only do heavy lifting and gaining strength and reps and progressive overload on their barbell lifts. Some are going to do strength training and jiu-jitsu. Some will just do cardio, and you have to really encourage them to do strength training, right? So, and some will just do body weight. So there's a number of modalities, and it's all about how does fat loss work, and how can we adapt a program to make that work in the favor of the client's individual needs and psychology, okay? So hopefully that made sense. Leave your questions and comments down below, and if you disagree with me, that's fine. Just make sure you point out, the points that you disagree with, and we can have a productive conversation, okay? Because I love criticism, actually. Have an amazing day, everyone. I will talk to you all in the next video.